friends. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see you all. We are looking forward to learning with you today. I just want to highlight a few things before we jump in. Firstly, if any of you are Trekkies, or if you're not a Trekkie, but you are interested in recovery from like addiction, tonight we have a program with Adam Nimoy, son of Leonard Nimoy, on Star Trek, The Road to Recovery and Reconciling with My Father. That's in person, and it's also virtual. Also next week, out of Eretz Yisrael, with my colleague, Rabbi Avidan Friedman, is doing Has Religious Zionism Lost Its Way? Reclaiming Important Lost Voices. So if that interests you with Avidan Friedman next week, we welcome you to that as well. As for today, we are excited to dive in with Working with Shattered Vessels, Ecology and Environmental Ethics in Jewish Law and Theology. About our speaker today, Rabbi Dr. Ariel Evan Mayse is an assistant professor of religious studies at Stanford University, rabbi-in-residence at Atiq, Jewish Maker Institute, and senior scholar in residence at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and Society, where he's the founder of Nahara, Beit Midrash for Environmental Renewal. He holds a Ph.D. in Jewish Studies from Harvard University and rabbinic ordination from Beit Midrash Har'el in Israel. His publications include Speaking Infinities, God and Language and the Teachings of Rabbi Dr. of Mezritsh, and the 2-volume A New Hasidism, Roots and A New Hasidism, Branches with Arthur Green, and Laws of the Spirit, Ritual Mysticism, and the Commandments in Early Hasidism. He's currently working on a book about Jewish mysticism and environmental ethics, and another exploring how Jewish spirituality can help us rethink the purpose, aims, and practice of higher education. Friends, this is a really important topic, urgent, and thankfully, the Jewish tradition has a lot to say on it. And I know many of the people in the room here are not only very invested, but are also educators on this topic. So we look forward to a fascinating presentation, followed by a conversation and Q&A. Of course, at any point, if you want to type in the chat, you're also welcome to do that. Rabbi Dr. Ariel Evan Mayse, welcome.
Thanks so much, Rav Shmuley. It's really great to be here with you all today, in times when it feels like the sadness is overwhelming and heartbreak is endless and solace elides. I find gathering together to think and to be with one another to be really the balm for a tired spirit. It's really wonderful also to be with so many familiar faces and not yet familiar faces. If I use a term that doesn't make sense, or if I say something that doesn't quite land, or if there's any point of clarification, please, please, please either type into the chat or find some other way of communicating with me. I want to make sure that things are as clear as possible, and I'm hoping also that we'll have a lively conversation about the questions that I raise. It probably comes as no surprise to anyone in this room that we are in the midst of a major ecological catastrophe that is eminently visible and becoming even more so in everything from extreme weather events and loss of biodiversity to depletion of all kinds of natural resources in the pollution of air, water, and soil. Scientists show us that we are crossing threshold after threshold, that entire ecosystems are on the verge of collapse, and that as part of those systems of life, we are on the verge of cataclysm. The impact upon human beings is already being felt, albeit quite disproportionately, but those proportions will only grow universally in the decades to come. These statistics, as I see them, amount to a grave moral, existential, and theological crisis of our day, one that should be prompting us to consider our ways of acting, thinking, and being in the world. But in part because of the magnitude and complexity, even cataclysmic reports from the IPCC or other governmental bodies and dramatic climate models seem not to motivate large-scale change. The science is in, but the jury is out. How will we respond? There are many reasons for our reticence and our inability to respond. Climate change is what sociologists sometimes call a wicked problem. It's hard to wrap our minds around the fact that the deep flourishing of this world and its inhabitants may well be incompatible with modernity, or at least our version thereof. So much of our modern thinking is defined by the march of progress, the valorization of endless expansion and growth, economic or otherwise, and assumptions about the stability of the physical world. This is compounded by the fact that across the past 3 centuries, a rift has been drawn in between nature and culture, between our bodies and the natural world, amplified by the way that modern literature and philosophy tend to focus on the individual as the primary moral agent and actor. But responses grounded in market individualism have failed to generate the collective action necessitated by this moral and theological crisis. This, combined with the fact that we in our day have seen a tremendous and unprecedented increase in the change of technological, temporal, social levels, pretty much on all levels, that has left us spinning. As it pertains to the questions of ecology and climate ethics, I very much subscribe to the notion that in many respects what we call post-modernity is actually hyper-modernity or super-modernity, and it's an acceleration of everything that we've seen before. Part of the work of formulating a response is the need to remake our social, economic, and intellectual systems in light of a very different perception of ourself and of the world, namely that we live in a porous and interconnected world, one that is united by a vast and complex interchange of natural forces that are not necessarily hospitable and which seem to be becoming increasingly less so. We need new practices and rituals, since our moral, theological, and philosophical beliefs are often shaped by action rather than by the other way around. So enter religion. What does religion have to bring to the table? Is it just that there are lots of religious people? That's true. Is it good? Is it because religion is good at getting people to work together? I'm not sure about that, even though that is often bandied about as a reason why religion should be taken seriously. The field of religion and ecology really has emerged out of a backlash against an essay that was published in the 1960s, which indicted Judeo-Christianity as a cause of climate change and of catastrophic climate transformations. This is the essay by Lynn White Jr., which has been cited thousands of times in the decade to follow, and it really set religious thinkers and practitioners back on their heels. Some kind of doubled down on attempting to undercut the science that explains climate change. Others have attempted to green ancient traditions through heavy-handed reinterpretation, showing that something like sustainability is really there all along. Still others mind religious literatures, and that's a phrase that I use intentionally, for notions that are quite analogous to contemporary environmental keywords. For example, I read the New York Times and then I think, how do you say stewardship in Jewish? There's nothing necessarily wrong with any of those things. They all contribute in positive ways. But there's a downside, and that's that it is that these approaches do actually little more than to repeat established paradigms without offering alternative worldviews or ethical frameworks. I think there's deeper work that needs to be happening, of exploring traditional sources with an eye to alternative modes of theorization, evaluation, that can unseat assumptions about humanity and our relationship to the non-human world. So in what follows, across the next half hour, give or take, I'm going to offer 5 specific points, ways of thinking about the ways in which Jewish traditions can be helpful for thinking about a contemporary climate ethic, for contemporary climate theology, for contemporary law and policy. And I'm happy to talk more about those and about others as we go from that into the question and answer section of our time together. Let's go to the first of the 5 different, let's say, arenas, theaters, laboratories of ideas, issues, however we want to talk about it. The first issue is something that I use, the phrase that I received from Donna Haraway, the environmental philosopher and biologist. It's called staying with the trouble. Anyone read in the news recently about how we have to act before it's too late? This many parts per million, this many issue. I talk to my friends who are climate scientists at Stanford. It's one of the places that I work. And they're like, dude, too late was like 15 years ago. A more honest response to climate change is that we're actually already in the realm of the too late. And the question is what we do with that. The question is how we act in light of that knowledge. What I refuse to do is give into any kind of nihilism or pessimism in a pervasive sense. But I think that there is a dose of realism of approaching the fact that the world as we know it will change in profound ways, even if we go carbon neutral tomorrow. Maya Khosla, the poet from Sonoma County, calls it coming to terms with that which is terminal. The great poet Adrian Rich has called it diving into the wreck. Rather than averting our eyes and pretending it's fine, this is fine, like that meme that went around a few years ago, we keep our eyes on that which is difficult and do what Donna Haraway would call staying with the trouble. In part, that's terrifying because it requires indeterminacy. In part, that's scary because it requires openness to change that we do not control. And in part, that is terrifying because it requires admitting that perhaps we haven't been right. Poetry is something that I come back to time and time again, especially for this element of my project. The poem that you have in front of you from the great Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai is not a poem about environmentalism per se, but it's a poem about the way that the ground that is untilled by doubt, by ground that is untilled by reflection, by ground that is untilled by things that are kind of scary, nothing can grow. Mina makom shebo anu tzodkim lo yitzmechu leolam prachim ba'aviv. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. Amakom shebo anu tzodkim hu ramus v'kashe kemo chatzer. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard, like a courtyard. Imagine a place that is filled with pavement. Imagine a place where urban planners talk about the level of ground permeability. It's something that has to do with flooding and whether or not rainwater can actually seep or whether it falls into the streets and it causes floods. Here is ground that is impermeable because it is so perfect in its own self-perception. Here's one of my favorite lines. Aval sveikot ve'ahavot osim et ha'olam letachuach kamo chafarferet, kamo charish. Doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow. Ulechisha tishama b'makom shebo haya habayit asher necharav. Whispers will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. Ruins are places of profound power in the Jewish tradition. They're places of revelation. They're places where sanctity is never quite evaporated. Sanctity never leaves them. The ruin of the temple, the ruin of a synagogue, the ruin of something that has come to be. Where do we put the broken tablets? Those too go in the ark. And there is an interesting sense within Jewish thought and theology that that which is broken actually allows for transformation. Sometimes forestry is a helpful analogy. One of the organizers of Firefighters for Fire, I believe his name is Tim Ingold, who has fought tooth and claw to try and change the way that American policy deals with fire, says as follows: when most people look at a burned forest, they see a mortuary. But botanists, naturalists, and sometimes firefighters don't just see a mortuary, they see a nursery. They see the possibility of growth, of renewal, of transformation. That doesn't mean that the burned out forests of contemporary superfires are something to be desired, but it does mean that things that are scary and things that are, on one level, quite destructive can actually lead to the complicated work that allows for true transformation, the work of love and the work of doubt. When ordinary people build things out of broken things, it doesn't work well. But it's interesting that one of the great descriptions of that we have of God is the worker of broken vessels, the one who is willing to take up that which is broken and not just show it respect, but to actually use it in the process of creation. One of the oldest midrashim that we have is about God creating worlds and breaking them down. Bonei olamotu machrivan. And the way that the Kabbalists, the Jewish mystics, all read that is that God creates the next world from the rubble of the previous one. So there's a continuity. But that continuity is complicated, and sometimes things really have to change in order for things to get better. Now, if you talk to Jewish thinkers, if you talk to indigenous thinkers, if you talk to Black theologians, apocalypse is not a new thing. Apocalypse is actually something very old. Franny Choi, who is a great contemporary poet, has a beautiful poem. Here, I've given you an excerpt from it called "The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On," which is that crisis is a kind of mentality that actually presents us from seeing the way that these things have happened before. And it doesn't mean that they're something to be yearned for, but it means that we have a choice in the way that we respond to them. Here, going all the way back to the book of Isaiah, we have 2,500 years about what it means to think and stay with the trouble. The book of Lamentations, the book of Jeremiah, these are particular examples of it. When Jeremiah castigates the people of Israel right on the eve of the destruction of the Beit Midrash, of the temple, Jeremiah says, don't put your trust in illusions and say, it's God's house, it's God's house, it's God's house. It'll never get broken down. Here, I see Jeremiah as calling the people to task for their moral bankruptcy and hiding behind the edifice of stability. And there's something very natural about that. In the book of Lamentations, we get a very poignant image of the way that the people are looking for deliverance, even on the eve of cataclysm, even in the midst of cataclysm. And yet, if we allow our eyes to drift toward what in other terms might be called a deus ex machina, some kind of deliverance that comes from outside, we can't actually deal with the root problems, social, economic, theological, philosophical, that have led us to this point. And that's very much Jeremiah's point. Jeremiah's point is you put your trust in these illusions and say, God's house can never be destroyed. And yet, if you read the next parts of chapter 7, you pay no attention to those in need. You pay no attention to your social and theological and ethical responsibilities, hiding simply behind this stability. One of the ways that this percolates in Jewish thinking is in the way that Maimonides describes the necessity of accounting in the wake of misfortune. And what he describes here is that fasting, a ta'anit, which is a public it's a public ritual, it's a public expression, is an opportunity for mourning, but it's also an opportunity for reckoning. So what Maimonides claims here, and I should just note that this is about drought. Like the link to climate thinking here is almost 1-to-1. What Maimonides says is that if you refuse to do this kind of reckoning, this kind of thoughtful reflection, you have become guilty of what we might call a complete evacuation of moral responsibility. What he says is that if you claim that a drought is just something that happens, right? Like I literally hear this all the time. Climates change, things change, they're this phase and that phase. And then you show them the golden spike or you show them the emissions, and they're like, yeah, well, still, it's, climate's never been stable, blah, blah, blah. True, and yet the link, and we have very good predictive models, but we also have very good models historically for showing the way that human-induced anthropogenic climate change is linked to industrialization and the carbon economy. That's not really a question for either the economists or for the natural scientists. And the question is, so what? So what do we do with that? And Maimonides would remind us that if we say this is just the way things happen, we have undertaken what Maimonides calls a pathway of achzariyut, callousness, cruelty, to say, yeah, some people suffer, that's how it is. There are versions of this about the flood. There are versions about this in many different other elements of Jewish thinking, but I'll save that for a little bit later. I'm sorry, we got to skip over Jane Hirschfeld. It's in the packet that maybe, Alex, you can send out to all the registrants. So just the last thing about staying with the trouble, or perhaps two other points about that before we move on. The first is a way of thinking that I came to in the writings of Kyle White, who is a really wonderful philosopher and environmental scientist. He teaches at the University of Michigan. Kyle White draws out in one of his essays the difference in between what he calls a mindset of crisis versus a mindset of coordination. He calls them epistemologies, but it's a mindset, it's a mode of thinking. And so his version of the epistemology of crisis is one of two things happen. Either you say, yeah, it's okay, it's gonna work out, because a crisis kind of puts us into fight or flight mode. Or, I'm sure this has never happened to anyone else in the room, I've been in fights with people that I love, and I've never ended a fight with someone that I love and thought, I'm just so proud of the way I spoke there. I felt like I was really my best self. I was thinking expansively. No, when you fight, and you go into fight or flight mode, you double down on the things you think you know. And sometimes you even have these moments, or I have those moments where I'm like saying something and I'm like, oh, come on. But it comes out anyway, and that's crisis mode. Crisis mode is something that constricts the horizon of possibility, as opposed to an epistemology of coordination. That's murmurating darlings, I think, in case you're wondering. And here is a little précis of that, a little synopsis, which is, in White's words, ways of knowing the world that emphasize the importance of moral bonds and kinship relationships for generating the responsible capacity to respond to constant change. This is one of the great summaries of all of Jewish thinking in Masechet Ta'anit, which is all about fasting, which you saw there a little bit in Maimonides, and all about the question of how do we work together when things are really scary, when things are really hard, as opposed to saying, I'm in the right place, going back to the language of Yehuda Amichai. Rather, here I am saying, yes, the world is transforming, but I look to the left of me and I look to the right of me and try to figure out how can we respond together. Okay, much to say about climate engineering and how technology will not solve all of our problems, but I will move on just to say that if you look to technology, whether it's carbon abatement or whether it is other kinds of radiation abatement and geoengineering, while Judaism has a robust appreciation for technology, in the case of climate engineering, I think there's actually a great fear in the Jewish sources of what happens when A, the things you create control you, and B, how they prevent us from doing the kind of very important moral work that is necessary to actually fix the problem. The connection here in the first source about the generation of the flood and the generation of the Tower of Babel, the two generations that are in some ways emblematic in the Jewish imagination of thinking about A, misplaced coordination, and B, hubris rather than humility. Here you actually have people literally trying to build a tower to hold up the floodgates. It's from 2,600 years ago. It's addressing the same question as what we have in our contemporary moment. Okay. So lest we think only in terms of not despondency, but this kind of frank realism, and again, plenty more to say about that, there's another element of Jewish thinking that I think is absolutely critical, and that is seeing the world as one that shimmers with divinity, a world in which the landscape, the animals upon it, and the people upon it are radiant with God's energy. This, in the language of scholarship and to a certain degree theology writ large, is called pantheism or panentheism, and in Jewish sources has many different forms. There's one that really comes to the fore in the 16th century, and there's another that comes to the fore in the 18th century in Hasidism. And in a little letter from one Hasidic thinker to another in the 18th century, it's a letter in beautiful, very highfalutin Hebrew, someone is trying to explain to someone else the kind of, let's say, the fundament of Hasidic spirituality, and he slips from Hebrew to Yiddish intentionally and says, I'll explain it to you. Als is Gott. Everything is God, which is basically what the source in front of you says. Hu bara et hakol, God created everything, vehu hakol, and God is everything. There are many different ways of explaining that. There are many different ways of thinking about that. There are many different paradoxes that entails. But that, I think, is another key element for the way that Jewish thinking that overcomes this nature-human binary. It's like what Timothy Morton, the philosopher, says, we need to get beyond nature in order to have true ecology. Why? Because there's no such thing as human versus nature. This is all a part of what this cosmos is, and there's no difference in an essential sense in between us and the world around us, because we are all animated and united by the same radiant qualities. We live within a porous world, a world that is animated by that divinity. In the language of the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, we might call it unity without uniformity. Because at the same time, there is a tremendous appreciation in Hasidic sources for the multifaceted nature of life. Everything in its specific qualities is valuable. Everything in its specific qualities is a voice of revelation. Should make us think about what the extinction of a species might cause. The extinction of the species is the end of a face of God, maybe the end of a layer of Torah. It's the end of a voice that began at Sinai and would otherwise have never stopped. You see this also in sources from the 13th century. This is just one, it's one of my favorites, of the story of the protagonists of the Zohar in the 13th century, who are wandering around the Galilee, at least in their imagination. They're probably actually wandering around medieval Spain, and they come to a tree, and they say, "How wonderful is this tree, how lovely is the shade. We must adorn this place with words of Torah." And one of the things that's so remarkable about the Zohar is that it paints a vivid portrait of a landscape in which divine human encounters happen for sure through the text and for sure through the journey inward through the self, but they also happen when you meet a mountain, when you meet a bird, when you meet a river, and for sure when you meet a tree. And I love the response here. We have to leave something some kind of an offering. And what do we do that is the highest of the values in the Jewish imagination? The gift of learning, the gift of what the Zohar calls milin chadatin atikin, words that are at once both ancient and new. And that's the gift that we give to the tree in return for the shade. That's the gift that we give for the trees in return for that encounter. In thinking about this, I often like to return to the work of a really wonderful anthropologist. Her name is Deborah Bird Rose. She unfortunately passed away a few years ago, who has written a number of wonderful books on the power of landscapes in religious imaginations. And in several of those, she develops a notion that she received from the Yolngu Aboriginal peoples of Northern Australia called Biryun. And Biryun, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is often translated as either radiance or shimmering. And it is the quality of a landscape that vibrates and invites participation. It's also the word that's used in these cultures for that moment when art ceases to be a drawing and becomes something more, when the website, as it were, goes live. And so this is a description of a world that is filled with ancestral wisdom, which is filled with a kind of animated property, which is very much at odds with our vision of the world as a static object, because this is a world that is a subject, and we exist in relationship with it. That's very much the description of the land in the Hebrew Bible. That's very much the description of the land, especially in the book of Leviticus. If you look toward the end of the book of Leviticus, the land is not just an object. It's not that things happen to the land grammatically, theologically, morally. The land is the actor. The land sits its Sabbaths. The land spits forth the people who do not live up to the moral necessities of being in that land. And this is something that is both beautiful and also frightening. A thinker in the 20th century, who I don't think ever really thought about ecological issues per se, living where he did, was in some ways, I think, quite prescient. He describes the flood that Noah underwent, and remarks that it's all in the passive, and asks why that might be. It doesn't say God does this or God does that. And so he suggests that the reason that it's in the passive is that it is an outcome, a consequence of human activity. The flood happens not as some kind of capricious retribution, but as an active world that responds back against the people. So here, to just sum up this point, we see a world that shimmers with divinity, which is not removed from us, but we are a part of it. We exist in communion with it, in communication with it, in relationship with it. And that is sometimes complicated and not always beautiful, but it is always powerful and never inert. A third domain in which Jewish thinking has so much to offer has to do with questions around non-human life, animal life, but not only, also vegetative forms of life. American law and American ethics really struggle to make sense of the place of the animal. It's true also of philosophy. There's a lot of really great literature on that. But one of the things that I think comes through so strongly in the Jewish thinking on this is that animals do not exist simply for human need, benefit, pleasure, work, etc. Animals exist because, full stop. And because they exist as an emblem, as an outcome of the divine will, they're not there for any other reason to serve our needs. They are there simply because they are. And this is why we owe them dignity. This is why we owe them care. This is why we owe them connection. Much to say about this, but two other things in specific that I'd like to say about that is, one, there's a an ancient midrash that I come back to time and time again, that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, but had it not been given, we would have learned it from the animals. It's always like a really nice source. But then I got to thinking, and I wondered, is that all we learn from the animals? They confirm what we already know from the Sinai revelation? And I got to thinking, what if we take seriously the notion that animals are revealers of God's Torah? But not just the Torah of Sinai. They're also the revealers of their own kinds of Torah, their own kinds of practice, their own kinds of ways of being. They have their own ways of acting in this world, which are totally unknown to us otherwise. There's an amazing midrash that exists in many different forms about Adam and Eve sitting basically before Shiva. They would be in what's called aninut, not knowing what to do with the body of their beloved Abel, because they had never experienced it. So they watch the animals, and they see that a raven comes and buries its dead. And they too know what to do. This is a totally different way of thinking about biomimicry. It's a totally different way of thinking about what human beings can learn from and absorb from the animals. I'm happy to talk more about that later. And the final point to say about this is that in this source from the 19th century, we find an inversion of the ordinary hierarchy. We often read the verse, "Let us make human beings in our image," as a summation of human superiority. We are so perfect, we're at the very top of creation. Now, that's not always the way that we've read it. We also have the rabbinic teaching in Sanhedrin that says, why are we created last? To remind us that we're an afterthought and that the mosquitoes came first. We're not necessarily the most important thing. But the source that you have in front of you reads it differently. It's that each creature, every species, the grizzly bears behind me, the salmon that they live in communion with, the ospreys, the eagles, the deer, the squirrels, each kind of creature is asked, do you wish to be created? And evidently they said yes. Although I wonder which kind of creatures are still there in abeyance. But they're not asked, should the other ones be created? Why? Because the mutuality of the animal world is such that each one contributes to what we would now call the thicket or the web of life. But each animal is asked about human beings. Should they be created? You may know the midrash about whether or not human beings should be created, and the angels say yes, and some say no. Or the different qualities, and God asks, should human beings be created? And some say yes, and some say no. So here, who was asked about whether or not human beings should be created? Marmots, salmon, gophers, moles. And what do they say? They say yes. And they give permission for our creation. So on the one hand, we're here. It's a fact. Of course, this text is going to have to say that. On the other hand, think about the moral implications of this. We exist not out of superiority toward the animals, not as their rulers, but how? By permission, by dint of their agreement. And when the great philosopher Emmanuel Levinas talks about obligations that are rooted before we come into being, this is a good example of it. So when God says, let us make the human being in our image, who is God speaking to? Not the angels, not the celestial retinue. God is speaking to the animals. As the presentation of this all draws to a close, I want to make two more big points. One is that I don't know if there are any environmental lawyers here in the room. If there are, love to talk to you more about this. There are some gaping holes in American law vis-a-vis all kinds of environmental issues. American environmental law has some wonderful, let's say, system files in the legislation passed in the early 1970s and some of it a little bit earlier. On the other hand, it is a ragtag patchwork of legislation that is splintered across different media, that is to say, air, water, land. different kinds of thinking, regulation, torts, etc., and is often incompatible at the state, federal, and local levels. It's really, really complicated. One thing that American law really lacks when it comes to environmental issues is a set of essential principles. You have this when it comes to issues around pollution in the EU, although pollution is just one substrate of the issues around the environment. Here, I actually think there's a really powerful intervention to be made by thinking with Jewish law, which is not to say that we just have to look in the Talmud and then we know what to do. But it is to say that there is a vision of what the noted legal philosopher Robert Cover described as the social obligation of Judaism as the cornerstone of Jewish law. Rather than rights, which is the fundament of American legislation, it's really about obligations. And that has really profound and significant implications for the way that we think about human beings as damage-causing agents. So I've spent a lot of time over the years developing different categories in which rabbinic law actually have a lot to do with questions of foreseeability, multiple causation, cumulative harm, externalization of costs, what the philosopher Robert Nixon calls slow violence and human degradation, questions of neighborliness and proximity, strict liability, all of these things which are really a part of the domain of legal thought. American law is kind of at a breach, and Jewish law can help us think by stretching the moral imagination that undergirds the law and can help provide us with a whole new vocabulary for thinking about what law could do and what law can be. So the final point I want to make is that while action and activism is really beyond important, especially when it is rooted in coordination rather than crisis, religious sources also remind us that sometimes the answer is not doing more, but doing less. And that stopping to think, to sense, to become open to the world around us, to bring down the walls, and to open up those floodgates through the work of contemplation can actually do two things. One, it allows us to take part in the world around us rather than just rushing through it. It also allows us to think otherwise and to remember that the world as it is not the world as it must be, and to pay attention to the micro phenomena that surround us in all of their radiant and majestic beauty, and at the same time to be open to the fact that gigantic transformations can begin with small shifts of attention. So much more to say. I'm going to pause here and open this up for conversation, and very much look forward to hearing your wisdom. I think I'll stop sharing also, just to truly enable us to see one another.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mayse. Yes, if anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to raise your hands and we can call on people to unmute, and you can always write things in the chat as well. Naomi?
Yes, I just wanted to express my gratitude and to reflect to those of us who are also educators, something that I found very compelling about your presentation, Rabbi Mayse, which was that despite talking about these things that might evoke panic, you yourself clearly were meditating or praying prior to teaching us. And so your groundedness and calmness helps us to think about these treacherous issues with equanimity. So thank you for modeling that.
That's so sweet. Thank you. I separate conversation. I am like the poster child for neurodiversity in academia. I am both dyscalculic and dyslexic, and you know, before there were like as many different ways of talking about this, I'm also the poster child of ADHD, and it is, I think, a very common trap for me to, you know, move from thing to thing and to have lots of different sources. And, that's sort of a perennial way into my brain. And I eventually just kind of embraced the fact that some people will go very deep on one source and some people will say, here, step into my heart and my brain and come look into the sort of the map of neurons that I am thinking about. But rather than racing from thing to thing in a kind of breathless panic, I very much try to help people and help myself find my feet as I lead them into that journey.
Thank you so much. Sandra?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for such a beautiful and inspiring presentation and so filled with wisdom. My question is I just want to hear you talk a bit about the notion of receptivity, because that also strikes me as part of the answer to not doing more, but doing less.
Yeah.
But it kind of a bridge between that contemplative approach and the actual doing and doing in a more public way. And anyway, that is the language of Leopold, Aldo Leopold, when he starts to try to develop a conservation ethic. And I have found that to be so important. I just want to hear you speak a little bit about how that might fit into your thinking.
Yeah, I mean, receptivity is a part of porousness, and it's really scary and also so powerful, and it allows for the ways of knowing that Leopold talks about, and then the love that will then flow from that. I often go back to a source in it's actually in the writings of the Piasetzner Rebbe, who lived in the 20th century and died in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it comes from his writings during the time that he lived in the ghetto, from I think it's from 1942 actually, which was, like imponderously terrible time in Warsaw. And what he describes there is he picks up this line from the liturgy of the angels as mekablein dain mi dain, that angels receive one from the other. And in the Hasidic version of the Shacharit morning prayer, angels are also invoked, and they give permission one to the other with love. That's the word that's added, with love, in the Hasidic version. And so what the Midrash says about that line, mekablein dain mi dain, which is a translation from the Aramaic from the book of Isaiah, is that when human beings are mekablein dain mi dain, when we have this kind of reciprocity and receptivity, then that happens to the angels. It's the sort of old Jewish story of the angels follow the human beings as opposed to the other ways around. And so he says, how do we do that in 1942? And he says, all you can do is to sit with people and stay with the trouble. That's one of the reasons that I come back with this, is that, on the one hand, we have he says we have a moral obligation to share everything that we can and to do everything that we can for other people. And there are some people that we can't help in a material sense. There's some things that can't be helped. There's some problems that can't go away. And this is something that I've learned very much from the world of climate justice that comes from the world of disability studies, is that so much of the crisis mentality is also about, we got to fix this, we got to make it better, and God bless, but build back better. Well, maybe that's not possible. There's a huge swath of people for whom that's not the dream. The dream is coping. The dream is being. And That's a much scarier way of thinking about it, and it has everything to do with how do you sit in the most beautiful place in nature. I'm thinking about, like Barry's The Peace of Wild Things. And then I'm thinking about Vanessa Andreotti and what it means to hospice an ecosystem or something like that. And those are both a part of the porousness that we need to be cultivating, which is as scary as anything. But it's like so many things, I've learned so much about myself and my tremendous failings from being a parent. But there are just so many moments where what my kids are asking is, can you just sit on the bench? Can you just sit next to me? And I'm like, well, I gotta help you. I gotta figure it out. And they don't quite say it in these terms, but they're saying, can you just be open? Can you just sit? Can you just receive?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Julian?
Yeah, thank you, Ariel, for a very, very beautiful and inspiring share. And you really fulfilled your promise at the beginning to go deeper than often what we hear in this subject. And my question really builds on what you just said about the Piasetzna. He says that there are some things that we can help and some things that we can't. We just have to be with the person who is with us. And in climate, there's some things that, in ecology, there's some things that we can't help, but there is a lot that we can do. And so my question is, do you have thoughts on how the spiritual orientations to this that you set out can perhaps express themselves in individual communal action?
Individual and communal action being distinct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the acts of individual communities. I just want to be clear.
Individual action or communal action.
Great.
Yeah. How do we take these teachings to the level of practice?
Great. So here, I think this is where I think the balance in between, this is the 18,000-foot answer, Agadah and halakhah, which are these two great reservoirs of Jewish thinking. Agadah, narrative, myth, different ways of conceiving the world. We have narrative ethics as well as theology. And then halakhah, which, I think the worst translation of that is Jewish law, and we all use it, but it's not law per se, especially in the way that it's commonly thought of. The way that I think about halakhah is how values are set into the idiom of action. So it's how do you practically apply the values that you find in the narrative through rituals as well as through other kinds of obligations. So I think there are many ways in which this happens, but I think there's a trap that we fall into of thinking that it's a question of just the individual. One of the things that in my class on religion and ecology we used to end with, and now we start with, is that I ask my students to take one of the climate footprint calculators, and then they think about it, and then we talk about the fact that it was invented by BP to displace liability away from corporations and onto the individual. And on the other hand, despite the fact that obviously mass action, which is everything from civil disobedience to working with lawmakers, administrators, and advocates to try and create change on the federal and state levels, there's something very profound in the DNA of the way that Jews think about action, which is that individual choices do matter, and it's not just virtue signaling, and that collective change sometimes comes from the top and oftentimes comes from the bottom, which means, choices in the way that each one of us live our lives, and the way that we see ourselves is then not in a pedantic sense, but trying to educate others and learn from others. This goes back to receptivity. I have been made and unmade so many times by my communications with people who have something to show me and show me all the blind spots of my own thinking. But the specificity of that grows out of the fact that human obligation is in fact, I think, really the cornerstone of this project. I think that has implications for our treatment vis-a-vis animals and farming and all sorts of things. It also has implications about the way in which we are participants in the carbon economy. It's implications for all of that. And does it matter that I buy organic zucchini? Is that going to be the thing that saves the polar bears? The answer is no. on the other hand, if enough people do those things and enough people pressure and enough people create normalization of this kind of discussion, then yes, there can be really tremendous and profound sea changes in culture.
Thank you.
I also think that in terms of Jewish religious life, it means rethinking what we call ta'amei hamitzvot, the kind of reasons of the commandments, such that there are certain mitzvot that I think have drifted from their original ideas. And that's a time where both the ritual grammar, that is to say the actual action, as well as the ideas need to be rethought. And on the other hand, there's a lot of stuff out there that hasn't quite been done yet. And so when I see another thing about Shemitah, or another thing about Shabbat, or another thing about the same categories, Tzar Baalei Chaim, which is like, it's great until you look at it and realize that the way that it's always been formulated, it means that you shouldn't be too mean to animals, or don't waste, except if like there's some kind of human benefit. Here, I think what Heschel called the moral audacity and spiritual grandeur of the way that we can take a hold of the tradition, think with it, and also allow its deepest values to really become articulated as something that those in, the rabbinic leaders of all different stripes and all across the denominations are contributing toward, and I think we would do well to continue in that good work.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi Mayse, for leading us in this very important topic and teaching us today. And thank you all for tuning in and joining. And thank you all again. Finally, one last thank you to Temple Solel for co-sponsoring today's event. And thanks again for joining. Have a great day.